All right, let's talk about someone history completely slept on. Like, everyone knows Alexander the Great, right? Julius Caesar, Hannibal. These names get thrown around all the time. They're in movies, video games, memes. They're cultural icons. But ask someone about Pyrrhus of Epirus, and you'll probably get blank stares. Maybe they'll vaguely remember something about a Pyrrhic victory from a history class they half slept through. And that's absolutely criminal because this guy was arguably one of the most talented military commanders who ever lived, and he's basically been reduced to a cautionary phrase about winning too hard. It's like if we only remembered Michael Jordan for missing shots. It's that level of disrespect. So Pyrrhus was born around 319 BCE in Epirus, which is basically modern-day northwestern Greece and southern Albania. Not exactly the centre of the ancient world. This wasn't Athens with its philosophy schools, or Sparta with its legendary warriors, or Macedonia with its conquering armies. Epirus was like the middle-of-nowhere mountain kingdom that bigger powers sometimes forgot existed. And Pyrrhus's start in life? Absolutely brutal. When he was just a baby, we're talking 2 years old, his father, Aeacides, got overthrown in a coup. Baby Pyrrhus had to literally flee for his life. His guardians smuggled him out of the kingdom while angry mobs were hunting for him. Imagine growing up knowing you're supposed to be king, but you're literally in exile as a toddler, completely dependent on the kindness of strangers and allies. That's the origin story we're working with here. Most people would have given up, accepted a quiet life somewhere, maybe become a merchant or something. Not Pyrrhus. But here's where it gets interesting, where his story takes a turn that sets him up for greatness. Pyrrhus didn't just sit around feeling sorry for himself or fade into obscurity. Through a series of political maneuvers and alliances, he ended up in Egypt at the court of Ptolemy, the first Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most successful successors, who had carved out the Egyptian chunk of Alexander's empire. And this is crucial because Pyrrhus basically got a masterclass education in warfare from people who had literally fought alongside Alexander. Think about what that means. He's learning from veterans who had conquered the Persian Empire, who had marched to India, who had revolutionized warfare. He studied under the best, learned from the legends, absorbed everything like a sponge. And everyone who met him was like, yeah, this kid is different. Ptolemy himself recognized the talent and actually helped Pyrrhus regain his throne in Epirus when he was still a teenager. At age 17, Pyrrhus became king. 17. Most of us are struggling with high school drama at that age, and this guy is running a kingdom. Now, I could just tell you Pyrrhus was good at war, but let me put this in perspective with something that should blow your mind. Hannibal Barca, the guy who crossed the Alps with war elephants to terrorize Rome. The dude who almost single-handedly brought the Roman Republic to its knees. Literally ranked Pyrrhus as the second greatest general of all time, right after Alexander the Great and before himself. Let that sink in for a second. Hannibal, arguably one of the most brilliant tactical minds in human history, a man who humiliated Rome for years, put Pyrrhus above himself, above every Roman general he ever faced, above Scipio Africanus, who eventually beat him, above everyone in history except Alexander. When someone of Hannibal's caliber gives you that kind of respect, you know it's not hype, it's facts. And it wasn't just talk or reputation. When you look at what Pyrrhus actually did on the battlefield, it's legitimately mind-blowing. This guy fought over 100 battles in his lifetime. 100. And he was known for personally leading cavalry charges, fighting in the front lines with his men, and pulling off tactical maneuvers that still get studied in military academies today. He wasn't some general sitting on a hill 5 miles back, pointing at maps while drinking wine. He was in the thick of it, sword in hand, getting wounded multiple times, losing teeth in combat, taking spears to the body, and still somehow surviving and winning. The ancient historians describe him as having this almost supernatural awareness on the battlefield. He could read the flow of combat in real time, spot weaknesses in enemy formations, and exploit them before his opponents even realized what was happening. He'd move units around like he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. The Battle of Heraclea in 280 BCE is a perfect example of his genius. Pyrrhus brought 20 war elephants, which the Romans had literally never seen before in their lives. Imagine being a Roman soldier. You've trained to fight other infantry, maybe some cavalry, and suddenly these massive beasts are charging at you, trumpeting and crushing everything in their path. It's like bringing tanks to a sword fight. But it wasn't just the elephants that won the battle. Pyrrhus combined them with his Macedonian-style phalanx tactics, heavy cavalry, and light infantry in a way that completely overwhelmed one of Rome's consular armies. The Romans, who would go on to conquer the entire Mediterranean world and build an empire that lasted centuries, got absolutely schooled by a king from a backwater kingdom they'd barely heard of. Pyrrhus studied his enemies, adapted his tactics to their strengths and weaknesses, and executed his battle plan flawlessly. The Romans lost thousands of men and were forced to retreat. It was a statement victory that announced to the ancient world, Pyrrhus is here, and he's a problem. Then there's the Battle of Asculum, which we'll get to, but also his campaigns against the Macedonians, where he consistently outmaneuvered armies that should have crushed him. Or his battles in Sicily, where he nearly drove the Carthaginians completely off the island. Every time you read about his battles, there's this pattern of him being outnumbered or out-resourced, but winning through pure tactical brilliance and personal courage. Okay, so here's where Pyrrhus gets done dirty by history, and it genuinely makes me mad. Everyone knows the phrase Pyrrhic victory, right? It means winning a battle, but at such a devastating cost that it's basically a loss. Like, congratulations, you won, but you destroyed everything in the process, and now you're worse off than before. And yeah, it comes from Pyrrhus. But the way this phrase gets thrown around in modern times makes it seem like he was some reckless idiot who didn't understand strategy, who just threw his men into meat grinders for glory, who didn't know when to quit. That's completely, utterly wrong, and it misses the entire context of what he was facing. After the Battle of Asculum in 279 BCE, his second major battle against Rome, Pyrrhus won again. Like, definitively won. The Romans were forced to retreat, their casualties were heavy, and by any normal measure, it was a clear victory. But Pyrrhus lost many of his best officers and thousands of veteran soldiers, troops he couldn't easily replace because Epirus was a small kingdom. According to the historian Plutarch, when someone congratulated Pyrrhus on his victory, he supposedly replied with something like, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." And that quote became the basis for the entire concept of a Pyrrhic victory. But people forget the context, and the context is everything. He was fighting Rome. Rome, the civilization that would eventually dominate the known world for centuries. And he was beating them, repeatedly, with a fraction of their resources and manpower. The reason his victories were so costly wasn't because he was bad at strategy or reckless with his men's lives. It was because he was fighting enemies who absolutely refused to surrender, even when they were clearly losing. This is what made Rome terrifying as an opponent. Most ancient civilizations, when they lost a major battle, would sue for peace, negotiate, maybe pay some tribute. Not Rome. The Romans would just rebuild their armies, draft more legions, and come back angrier than before. They had this endless supply of Italian allies they could draw manpower from. These incredible resources from controlling the Italian peninsula. Pyrrhus was stuck in a war of attrition against an enemy with way more resources, more manpower, more wealth, and an insane refusal to ever admit defeat. The fact that he won any battles against Rome, let alone multiple decisive ones, is absolutely insane. He should be celebrated for that, not turned into a cautionary tale. It's like criticizing someone for not successfully fighting a grizzly bear with their bare hands. The fact that they survived at all is impressive. And let's be real, if Pyrrhus had lost those battles, nobody would remember him at all except as a footnote in Rome's rise to power. Instead, he won. He scared the Romans badly enough that they still talked about him generations later. And somehow, he's the one who gets the negative phrase attached to his name. History can be so unfair sometimes. Let's talk about why Pyrrhus was even in Italy fighting Rome in the first place, because this shows both his ambition and his genuine desire to help Greek cities in distress. The Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy was getting pressured by Rome's expansion. They were going to get conquered. They knew it, and they desperately needed help, so they called on Pyrrhus, offering him command of their forces if he'd come save them. Now, Pyrrhus could have said no. He had his own kingdom to worry about, his own problems. But he saw this as an opportunity, not just for glory, but to genuinely push back against Roman expansion and protect Greek culture in the West. Plus, he probably saw himself as a new Alexander, liberating Greek cities from barbarian threats. So in 280 BCE, he sailed to Italy with about 25,000 troops and those war elephants ready to take on Rome. After his victories at Heraclea and Asculum, Pyrrhus actually tried to negotiate peace. He sent his advisor Cineas to Rome to offer terms, and apparently Cineas was so impressed by the Romans' determination and resources that he warned Pyrrhus this enemy was different. The Roman Senate, in one of their most legendary moments of stubbornness, basically told Pyrrhus they'd never negotiate while foreign troops were on Italian soil. That's the Roman attitude right there. Pure defiance. Then Pyrrhus got invited to Sicily by the Greek cities there who were fighting against Carthage. And this is where you see his restless ambition. Instead of finishing the job in Italy, he sailed to Sicily and proceeded to absolutely dominate the Carthaginians for 2 years. He conquered almost the entire island, pushing Carthage back to their last stronghold. The Greek cities were celebrating him as a liberator, as their champion. He was on the verge of driving one of the ancient world's superpowers completely out of Sicily. But then, and this is so characteristic of Pyrrhus, he started getting autocratic with the Greek cities he'd just liberated. He wanted them to contribute more troops, more money, more resources for his next campaigns. The Greeks who had invited him started resenting him. Meanwhile, back in Italy, the situation was deteriorating without his presence. So Pyrrhus left Sicily before finishing the job, sailed back to Italy, and reportedly said, "What a battlefield I leave for Rome and Carthage," as he departed. And he was right. Those two powers would fight over Sicily for decades in the brutal Punic Wars. Here's the thing about Pyrrhus that makes him so fascinating and also kind of tragic. The man could not stop moving, could not stop fighting, could not rest. After he finally left Italy and returned to Greece around 275 BCE, having failed to defeat Rome decisively, but still having maintained his reputation, you'd think he might consolidate, rebuild, focus on strengthening Epirus. Nope. He immediately got involved in more wars. He invaded Macedonia and actually managed to drive out the Macedonian king and briefly take control. Then he got invited to help in a succession dispute in Sparta, and decided, sure, why not fight the legendary Spartans? He laid siege to Sparta itself, which was incredibly rare since Sparta had no walls and relied on its warriors' reputation to protect it. The siege failed, but the fact that he even attempted it shows his confidence. Some historians say he lacked focus, that he was too ambitious for his own good, that he never finished what he started. And okay, there's some truth to that. He definitely had a habit of moving on to the next challenge before completely securing his previous victories. But honestly, the dude was just that good at war, and he knew it. He saw himself as the heir to Alexander's legacy, as the natural successor to lead Greek forces to glory. And in terms of pure military skill and tactical genius, he had every right to think that way. His problem wasn't incompetence or lack of ability. His problem was that he was operating during an era when the Mediterranean was full of emerging superpowers: Rome, Carthage, the Hellenistic kingdoms carved from Alexander's empire. And the resources mattered just as much as tactics. You could be the best general in the world, but if you couldn't field enough armies or sustain long campaigns logistically, you'd eventually get ground down. Pyrrhus was like an amazing boxer fighting opponents who just kept tagging in fresh fighters every round while he got more and more exhausted. And then there's how he died, which is genuinely one of the most ridiculous, anticlimactic endings for such a legendary warrior. After all his campaigns, all his victories, all his near-death experiences on battlefields across the Mediterranean, here's what finally got him. In 272 BCE, Pyrrhus was fighting in the city streets of Argos in Greece during yet another succession war he'd gotten involved in. He's 46 years old at this point, still fighting in the front lines like he's a young man, still personally dueling enemy soldiers. The fighting is intense, chaotic urban combat in narrow streets. Pyrrhus is in full battle mode, dominating as usual, cutting through enemies, when some random elderly woman watching the chaos from her rooftop gets worried about her son, who's fighting Pyrrhus. So what does she do? She picks up a roof tile, just a piece of her roof, and hurls it down at Pyrrhus. It hits him right in the head, on the back of his neck below his helmet. The impact stuns him, maybe fractures his spine, or gives him a serious concussion. He falls from his horse, dazed and vulnerable. And then an enemy soldier named Zopyrus, who probably couldn't believe his luck, comes up and cuts off Pyrrhus's head. A roof tile. One of the greatest military commanders in human history. a man who fought alongside and against the best generals of his era, who beat Roman armies and Carthaginian forces, who survived cavalry charges and elephant stampedes and countless battles, gets taken out by someone's mom throwing pottery from a window. It's almost poetic how anticlimactic it is, how absurdly random and undignified. Alexander the Great got mysterious fever that historians still debate about. Was it poison? Disease? We don't know. It's mysterious. Julius Caesar got dramatically stabbed to death in the Senate by his peers in one of history's most famous betrayals. Hannibal took poison rather than be captured by Rome in a final act of defiance. These are dramatic, memorable deaths that match their legendary lives. Pyrrhus got bonked by building materials thrown by a worried mom. If it wasn't so tragic, it would be hilarious. The randomness of it, the sheer bad luck, perfectly captures something about Pyrrhus's life. Brilliant, capable, legendary, but somehow never quite getting the ending that matched his talents. So why does Pyrrhus deserve way more respect than he gets? Why should we be talking about him alongside Alexander, Hannibal and Caesar? Because he represents something that doesn't fit neatly into history's narrative boxes. And that's exactly why he's important. He wasn't part of a massive empire that lasted centuries like Rome. He didn't fundamentally change the course of Western civilization like Alexander. He didn't leave behind architectural wonders or a detailed philosophical legacy. His kingdom of Epirus didn't become a major power after his death. In the grand sweep of history, his impact seems limited, and that's why he gets overlooked. But here's what history misses when it skips over Pyrrhus. He was possibly the most naturally talented battlefield commander of his entire generation. Not just good, possibly the best pure tactician of his era. In a different timeline, with more resources or better luck, or a different set of enemies, Pyrrhus could have built an empire to rival Alexander's. The raw ability was there, the courage was there, the tactical genius was there, the charisma to inspire troops was there. The people who actually fought against him knew how dangerous he was. The Romans, who weren't exactly prone to praising their enemies, respected and feared him. The other great generals of history, like Hannibal, studied his campaigns and ranked him among the best ever. Ancient historians devoted extensive writings to his life and battles. He earned all of that through demonstrated excellence, not through propaganda or myth-making. But because he ultimately didn't win in the grand historical sense, because his kingdom didn't endure, because his campaigns ended in strategic stalemates or withdrawals, because he died randomly in a street fight, he gets reduced to a cautionary tale about the cost of victory. He becomes a warning about ambition rather than a celebration of excellence. That's disrespectful to his actual legacy. Pyrrhus fought against impossible odds repeatedly and often won. He took on Rome when they were rising to power and made them genuinely afraid, something very few ever accomplished. He innovated battlefield tactics, combining different types of units in novel ways. He inspired fierce loyalty in his troops, who followed him across the Mediterranean. He earned the respect of Hannibal himself, which should count for something. If there's a lesson from Pyrrhus's life, it's not "don't win too hard," or whatever people think a Pyrrhic victory means. It's not about the cost of victory or reckless ambition. The real lesson is way more complex and honestly more tragic. Sometimes being the best at something isn't enough. Sometimes you can be brilliant, skilled, courageous, and dedicated, and still get screwed by circumstances beyond your control. Resources matter. Timing matters. Luck matters. The enemies you face matter. Pyrrhus had the misfortune of facing Rome during their rise, when they had the resources and manpower to absorb defeats that would have destroyed other nations. He had the misfortune of coming from a small kingdom that couldn't match the superpowers of his era in resources. He had the misfortune of living in an age where Greek military dominance was fading, while Roman power was ascending. But none of that diminishes what he achieved or how skilled he actually was. And that's what makes his story compelling. It's not a simple tale of triumph or a straightforward tragedy. It's complicated, messy, real. He won battles he shouldn't have won, survived situations that should have killed him, and earned a place among the greats through sheer ability. Pyrrhus deserved better, from his era and from history. He should be mentioned in the same breath as Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar when we talk about military genius. Instead, most people only know him from a phrase that doesn't even do justice to what he actually accomplished, if they know him at all. So yeah, pour one out for Pyrrhus of Epirus, the king who beat Rome, impressed Hannibal, fought 100 battles across the Mediterranean, survived countless near-death experiences, and then got taken out by a roof tile thrown by someone's mum. Absolute legend, criminally underrated, and proof that history isn't always fair to the people who deserve to be remembered.